The housing market is so expensive that income would have to jump 55% to make buying affordable.
Over the last 10 years, violence in schools towards teachers has grown an average of 3,200%. And if you didn't beat up your math teacher, you would know that's a very large increase. This past year alone, over 80% of teachers reported instances of victimization, physical or verbal. Is it teaching or Woodstock 99?
According to a recently released CDC report, sexual violence against teenage girls has sharply risen. And as many as 1 in 10 teenage girls have said that they've been forced to have sex.
What is wrong with the world today? This question isn't exactly a new one. This question is asked every generation as time and nostalgia soften the truth of the past into something more favorable than today's issues. Nostalgia is a hell of a drug. It's linked most strongly with your sense of smell, hence why the scent of cookies in the oven or salt at the beach may bring to mind childhood memories more efficiently than an old photograph. Unlike homesickness, nostalgia is a more ambivalent emotion that works as a motivator, and according to several studies, increases happiness and social behaviors and decreases anxiety. An article titled The Power of Nostalgia, What Science Tells Us About Longing for the Past, reports that a 2016 study used fMRI imaging to monitor participants' brain activity when exposed to nostalgia-inducing stimuli. When nostalgia was triggered, participants' brains showed activity in two powerful neural networks, the areas of the brain associated with memory and the brain's reward system. This is one of the reasons why nostalgia plays a significant role in rosy retrospection, a theory that suggests that we view the past with a bias. Because we prefer to linger on the positive, those memories remain strong, while negative ones become more challenging to retrieve. Aptly named the fading effect bias, researchers have observed that memories associated with negative emotions fade more quickly than those associated with positive emotions. In other words, remembering the good things about the past is easier than remembering the bad.
100% true. It's why nostalgia is always a powerful tool for fascists, because they make people who are unsatisfied with their present yearn for a fictional past in which somehow for them everything was better. That past could be 10 years ago, that past could be 50 years ago, that past could be 5,000 years ago. The key is that it is a comfortable, more safe time for people who look and walk and talk just like them. But it's always fictional. It's always faulty. It's always fake. And they can dress it up with any kind of symbolism that they want to. Right now, that symbolism is the American Revolution. They can dress up the patriots, they can dress up the founders, they can use these symbols like the flag or tricornered hats or crap like that. But in the end, the past that they want to invoke is a fake.
Compared to today's problems, the past seems more straightforward and pleasant. So the question we should ask first is, was the world actually better then than it is now?
This image has gone viral on trad Twitter, accounts that think that life was better in a pre-modern, pre-digital era. The proposition is that we gave up the good life of families and faith in exchange for making more money. We're richer, but unhappier. But what's funny about these memes is they often prove the exact opposite of the point they're trying to make. So for example, let's zoom in on the bottom two images. We have two dads playing with their kids. Kinda sweet, right? But now look closer. Both men are still in their workplace attire. It's late at night. Maybe these kids are getting a few minutes with their dads before bedtime. In other words, this ostensibly idyllic life actually depicts two absentee workaholic fathers who spend more time making money than they do with their families. And bear in mind, these are all from advertisements. That's not real life. That was someone's depiction of what they thought the ideal life was half a century ago. Okay, so now it's time for a reality check. Yes, we are several times wealthier today than we were in 1950. So we do make more money, but we don't do it at the expense of family time. In fact, we also spend more time with our children. Here's some country-by-country chart showing the time spent by parents with children each day. Blue lines for mothers, red lines for fathers. In the US, for example, mothers have doubled the amount of time they spend with children each day, while fathers have nearly tripled the amount, albeit from a lower baseline. Which means that the average father today spends more time with their children than the average mother did in 1965. In other countries, the increase has been even more dramatic. Like, check out Denmark up there. This just exposes how silly trad nostalgia for an imagined past really is. We are both richer and we spend more time with our families than they did in the past.
Before we can answer this, we must return to the good old days. For many Americans, this means the 1950s. Most of us haven't experienced the 1950s firsthand, given that the 50s was 70 years ago. Still, the aesthetics, the housewives of food on the table, the nuclear family, one-person income, the idea of leisure and balanced work and family life remain revered. Those who revere the simplicity of the 1950s seem to have forgotten that life held its own struggles back then. American society was indeed centered around family in the 1950s, but this was in part due to the propaganda war against communism, which pitted the more egalitarian work balance of communism and its brutal aesthetic against an image of American women, with their feminine hairdos and delicate dresses, tending to the hearth and home as they enjoyed the fruits of capitalism, democracy, and freedom. A wish to return to normalcy after the Second World War also spurred the pushback into the home. Although women had shown that they could take on so-called men's work, those jobs were expected to be relinquished to the men who had come back from war. There was immense pressure to return to the home and to focus purely on the domestic sphere. Conformity was the name of the game, and so few women who were able to attain a coveted housewife role, one only those well off enough to live on a single income could do, were not going to rock the boat by getting a part-time job or non-feminine hobbies, which could have caused them to be portrayed as selfish and cruel. However, the life of a housewife was often difficult, emotionally and socially, leading to depression and anxiety. Some argue that this was due to the social isolation and monotony of the lifestyle, while others blame it on the treatment of their husbands. Either way, the result was family doctors overprescribing 1950s housewives a medication called meprobamate, more commonly known by the brand name Miltown. Even if housewives could get the courage to leave or plan to do so under the haze of their barbiturates, independence as a woman was difficult. Until the Equal Credit Opportunity Act of 1974, women couldn't open a bank account without a husband's or her father's permission. She couldn't serve jury duty or practice law. Birth control was difficult to get and illegal in many states for years after its approval in the 1960s. If she did have a job, she could be fired from it for being pregnant until the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978. Ivy League universities wouldn't accept women, nor would military schools. Women couldn't serve in the military, serve in combat, or even enter the Boston Marathon. Another often overlooked aspect of the 1950s housewife dream is the difference in treatment between women of different races. Black women were not in the house wearing an apron and putting dinner on the table. Stemming from slavery, the dominant view of black women has been that they should be workers, a view that contributed to their devaluation as mothers of caregiving needs at home, which is why, compared with other women in the United States, black women have always had the highest levels of labor market participation, regardless of age, marital status, or presence of children at home. Black women made up a majority of the domestic labor force and often spent their lives caring for the children of others. If you weren't a white woman, you likely would have worked in the domestic or agricultural fields, not as a housewife. In addition, the 1950s were a period of callousness and medical experimentation that few seem to recall when reminiscing on those simpler times. Many deep-seated cultural fields within the black community may seem odd at first glance. A suspicion of the medical field is one of them.
This is one of the worst experiments ever conducted in the United States on people. It's the Tuskegee experiment. In 1932, 600 black men were recruited for a study in Alabama by being promised free medical care. 399 of these men were suffering from syphilis, a common STI, and the study promised medical care for the rest of their lives. But that's not what happened. Secretly, the study was designed to track the full progression of the infection, meaning that the subjects were not given real medicine. Instead, they were given aspirin and mineral substances. The progression of syphilis is terrible, and many men in the study went blind and insane. Meanwhile, researchers were watching this happen and did not intervene. Probably the worst part of this entire study was that in 1943, while the study was going on, penicillin became the most common cure of syphilis, but because it would have interrupted the study, none of the men were given it. The study was shut down in 1972, but at that point, many men had already lost their lives. President Bill Clinton formally apologized for the study in 1997, but for many, it was too little too late.
The Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which began in 1932 and was meant to record the natural progression of the disease, is perhaps the most well-known example in the United States. Despite penicillin being recognized as a treatment by 1943, treatment was not offered to those in the study, nor were they informed of the disease they carried. Those involved didn't even know what they agreed to, as they were told it was a study on bad blood, and participants mainly consisted of poor and illiterate sharecroppers. It wasn't until 1972 that Jean Howlett would bring the story to public attention. Beliefs about black people being hardier or more resistant to pain have persisted from the gynecological experiments of James Marion Sims on enslaved women to the modern day, and the racial tensions of the 1950s added to that mistrust, which turned out to be well placed. During Sims' time, white slave owners held a vested interest in the reproduction of black people, especially after the slave trade closed. The ability of their female slaves to create more slaves, an economic resource, was of great import to those who profited off their labor. However, by the 1950s, opinion shifted in the opposite direction, where a rising black population was seen as a threat and as undesirable. During the 50s and 60s, black women were sterilized at more than 3 times the rate of white women and more than 12 times the rate of white men. These programs didn't only affect black women. Professor Alexandra Minna Stern writes, eugenicists applied emerging theories of biology and genetics to human breeding. White elites with strong biases about who was fit and unfit embraced eugenics, believing American society would be improved by increasing breeding of Anglo-Saxons and Nordics, whom they assumed had high IQs. Anyone who did not fit this mold of racial perfection, which included most immigrants, blacks, indigenous people, poor whites, and people with disabilities, became targets of eugenics programs. Of course, this doesn't even touch on the various civil rights movements that were beginning to pick up pace, nor the impact of the Vietnam War, which would significantly define the next few decades. If you were a middle or upper class white man during this period, you might indeed have been satisfied with the status quo. However, as a whole, it was a terrible time for pretty much everyone. Of course, most of my viewers would not be pining after the 1950s. Nostalgia tends to be about 50 years behind us, which explains the revival of media set in the 80s and 90s. While fashion and media were undoubtedly fabulous and sharing their revival today, the 80s was when the AIDS epidemic began. By the end of 1981, AIDS was known as gay cancer, due to primarily gay men dying of it at its onset, though the term was not used until the following year.
When those first 5 cases were reported, there were already 250,000 gay men infected with HIV, and by the time the virus was discovered and an antibody test was commercially available, there were perhaps 500,000 gay men infected in the United States, and the vast majority of those men have died.
There's more than one aspect. There's a personal aspect of actual human beings who died. And then there is this culture that disappeared in 5 seconds.
All the plays never written, the performances never sung, the books never written, even the audiences that never filled the seats.
All the people we lost.
They want the same things out of life that all the rest of us want: to be loved, to grow old together, many of them, and they contributed to our society, and it is absolutely devastating that we lost so many.
Reagan refused to address the epidemic until it claimed over 23,000 lives in 1987, as he viewed it as a punishment for immoral behavior, ignoring that it could be spread via blood, semen, pre-cum, vaginal fluids, and breast milk, meaning that anyone could catch it via an unfortunate encounter with bodily fluids. Not only did this decimate the gay community, but it ravaged the black community, as although black and African Americans represent almost 13% of the U.S. population, they accounted for 42.1% of HIV infection cases in 2019. In 2020, African Americans were 7.8 times more likely to be diagnosed with HIV infection, as compared to the white population.
In May of 1982, teenagers of a congregation in Topeka, Kansas, destroyed thousands of dollars worth of records and tapes, which they felt contained the message of Satan. The Christian Concern sheds light on a more secular aspect of music listening. It's what you don't hear.
Certain parts of the men's uniforms all accentuate the genitals of a male. Faceless creatures in robes that, to me, would, from my study, certainly symbolize druids, which, of course, go back to Satan worship. In the blood stains, there is very definitely, without any shadow of a doubt here, a face of Satan.
The Satanic Panic also occurred during this time, when anxieties about childcare spread amongst the guild of needing to return to the workforce in the face of recession, and both conservatism and the religious right were on the rise, emphasizing the nuclear family. Amongst the rising awareness of child abuse, the novel Michelle Remembers caused many to consider the possibility of ritualistic satanic child abuse as a threat, which led to the suspicion regarding rock music, Dungeons and Dragons, and anything vaguely unchristian, as well as created a mob mentality towards those who deemed to be in cahoots. Workers at the McMartin preschool found their lives ruined over unsubstantiated and baseless rumors, and nearly 200 people were charged of crimes throughout the Satanic Panic, with dozens convicted. This coincided with the Cold War and Red Scare, which generated feelings of unease, anxiety, and mistrust in the community. Senator McCarthy leveled charges of disloyalty at celebrities, intellectuals, and anyone who disagreed with his political views, costing many of his victims their reputations and jobs. Any time considered the good old days had its own issues aplenty. There never was a good old days to return to, just different problems to fight against, which affect people differently. Today is no different.
Expectancy is declining in America. This red line is the US. As you can see, we've had lower life expectancy than other wealthy nations for decades. But the trend was for lives to keep getting longer. That all changed during COVID. But while other countries started trending back up in 2021, the US continued to decline. Researchers tried to sound the alarm 10 years ago. A study from the National Academies of Science, funded by NIH, found it's not just the poor or uninsured that have shorter lives. Even the richest people in the United States have shorter lives on average than the richest people in other wealthy countries. But why? There are a lot of factors, from diet, drug overdoses, and fatal car crashes, to higher child poverty, more income inequality, and access to firearms.
I really thought that when the results came out, they would be so obvious that people would say, let's finally do this.
Yet here we are 10 years later, and things are actually worse. Now, this all may seem overwhelming, but Fani says there's a bright side. If other countries have figured this out, so can we.
Stress from many sources is shortening the American lifespan compared to other developed countries. This is reported not by one professional, but several, including a cardiologist, endocrinologist, obesity specialist, health economist, and a social epidemiologist. The reasons for this life-shortening stress, according to recent polls, are factors beyond their control, including inflation, violence, politics, and race relations. A spring Washington Post ISPOS poll found that 50% of Americans said not having enough income was a source of financial stress. 55% said not having enough savings was also a source of stress. An article by Clea Johnson in the Washington Post points out that stress weathers minorities and those facing social ills greatly, causing adverse health outcomes. Quite simply, social inequality causes stress, leading to shortened telomeres and in turn premature aging, disease, and early death. And in this environment, why wouldn't you be stressed? Housing is unaffordable for many people, bringing to mind a pre-New Deal rental market where only the rich could afford to buy due to needing a large amount of money as a down payment first. Real estate data provider Adam reports that median home prices in 99% of areas are out of reach for the average income earner, who makes about $71,000 annually. While the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development recommends budgeting for 30% of your income towards rent, at salary levels below $30,000, spending above 30% of gross income on housing is the norm. Even with increased wages from the nationwide labor shortage, which gave low-wage workers the largest pay increases in most states between 2019 and last year, many of those workers, more than 40% of all U.S. households by one estimate, are struggling to cover inflated costs of basic expenses. This is because, despite recent wage increases, this does not significantly counteract the stagnant wages low-wage workers have dealt with for decades, as the costs for basics such as housing and healthcare have risen even faster than inflation.
Okay, just got back from the grocery store. I had to buy a couple of things. This is what I got. Some cereal, some milk, laundry detergent, deodorant, and toothbrushes. 5 items. Local Target. I live in a suburb of a medium-sized city. It's not like I, bought this stuff in Times Square. 5 items. Guess how much it was? Just guess. Well, here's the receipt. That's today, December 1st, 2023. $51.05.
Now, minimum wage in the state that I live in is $13.65. Gross daily wage is about $109, 69%-ish take home. That's $75. I would have to work almost a full day just to buy these 5 items. If you're making $120,000 a year, you might not be feeling this. Good for you. If you're making $40,000 a year, if you're making $1,000 a month, $12,000 a year, like people on Social Security, this is beyond struggling. This is beyond tough times and suck it up. This is a matter of, for a lot of people, survival. When you factor in rent, gas, car payment, whatever else, it's coming down to having to make really scary decisions. This is where we're at.
The effects are significant. The typical retail sales worker, the most common job in the country, lost $26,000 in buying power between 2007 and 2022. And as of 2021, 41% of American households were either in poverty or unable to afford basic needs in 2021. Most jobs in the United States do not support the middle class that older generations strove for or that we experienced ourselves as children. Not only are wages not high enough, but inflation and higher cost of living make the purchase value of the dollar lesser in multiple categories. And yet, at the same time, profits are at a long-time high. This is due to greedflation, which Pennsylvania Senator Bob Casey published a report on earlier this year, where he noted that between 2020 and 2022, corporate profits rose by 75%, which is 5 times as fast as inflation. He's not the only one to point out this trend.
One of the oldest investment banks in France is sounding the alarm at what might be the end of capitalism. One of the oldest and largest investment banks in the world warns that the greedflation that has been happening has gone too far. Anybody in the United States knows that prices have gone up and up and up, and companies are reporting record profits while the rest of us are absolutely suffering and struggling. There has been a major disconnect that has happened between the price of goods and the price that it costs to produce and ship these goods and the amount of profit that companies have been making. Just take a look at this graph. The red line shows the unit profit margins for major companies that continues to go up. The blue line are the non-labor costs, and the black line are labor costs, basically people's wages. There has been this massive disconnect that has happened where companies are seeing massive profit with no real change in the quality of goods or the wages that people are making. Y'all, we have been calling for this. We know this. But major investment banks are also saying, this has gone too far. This isn't inflation. This is pure corporate greed. I don't know if any corporations are going to take their calls seriously, but we know that the amount of debt that we all carry, the fact that 66% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck, that includes high-wage earners and people making well over $100,000 a year. We are all drowning in debt while corporations see record profits with absolutely no change in the services and barely any change to our wages. We have to keep speaking up and saying this is enough. Something is coming. I don't know what the answer is going to be, but this cannot continue.
While inflation, war, supply issues, and other global conflicts do account for some of the price increases, company profits have outpaced rising production costs and used inflation as a scapegoat to deny higher wages, lower prices, and to add more money to the wallets of their CEOs and shareholders. These rising costs place extra pressure on single men and women to couple up and cohabitate for financial reasons. In a CNBC article titled Why It's So Expensive to Be Single in the U.S., McNair explains why being single can be financially detrimental. Dollar for dollar, it is cheaper to be in a one-person household. After all, there's only one mouth to feed, one person using household essentials, and the home only needs to have enough space for one body. But when you add it all up, maintaining a single-person household doesn't cost exactly half of a two-person household. That's why it's cost the singles tax. It costs more to be on your own than it would for you to share costs with a partner. Here's the cost of a year's worth of typical expenses before taxes, including necessities such as food, housing, medical care, transportation, and more, in South Carolina, according to estimates from MIT. A single-person household will cost $29,880 a year. A two-person household will cost $47,483 a year. The two-person household could split costs down the middle and each contribute about $23,742 per year, whereas someone living on their own would need to cover that much plus an additional $6,138. The biggest factor is housing. Single people often have to choose between getting a roommate or covering the entire cost of a house or apartment on their own. In expensive cities such as New York, renting a studio apartment costs an average of $3,550 a month, according to Zumper data from October of 2023. That means someone living alone would pay $42,600 a year in rent, whereas a couple splitting the same rent down the middle would pay just $21,300 each. However, the financial costs do not outweigh the social, mental, or physical cost of partnering up. Not only is there a widening political divide between men and women, with women being more leftist while men lean right, but women hating and gendered violence are becoming increasingly common. Despite a push towards marriage, a goal many women do indeed aim for, one which has remained the same since the times of Bessie Smith, the explanation remains the same. The reason why people aren't getting married is a good man is hard to find. Looking back at previous research, it becomes evident that the problems women face today in dating can be traced back to the past. It's nothing new. And yet, women are blamed for the lack of or failed marriages. They are called narcissists and abusers, accused of being picky and only dating the richest, sleekest men, and for cruelly leaving men for a life on the streets. The reality is much more bleak.
I can't believe how this isn't talked about enough. I've been bombarded with comments saying that I didn't fight for my marriage hard enough, or that I've ruined my son's life by becoming a single mom. And that's not even scratching the surface of the stigma around single motherhood and what we already have to deal with in the aftermath of leaving a toxic relationship. I've been called a because my husband cheated on me, that I picked my husband and that's why I have to deal with the consequences of how he treated me. And I've been asked what I did to deserve being cheated on. Somehow it's always women getting blamed for everything, no matter what we do. If we stay, it's our fault for staying when we knew they were treating us badly. If we leave, we get criticized for breaking up a family or not fighting hard enough for your marriage, and we're quitters. Either way, people are going to criticize, and either way, we can't win. So we might as well just always choose happiness and choose what makes us feel safe and loved.
On the rare occasions that women are actually asked about their experiences with relationships, the answers are rarely what anyone wants to hear. In the late 1990s, the sociologist Catherine Eden and Maria Kefelas interviewed 162 low-income single mothers in Camden, New Jersey and Philadelphia to understand why they had children without being married. Money is seldom the primary reason. Mothers say they are no longer with their children's fathers. Instead, mothers point to far more serious offenses. Dr. Eden and Dr. Kefelas write, "It is the drug and alcohol abuse, the criminal behavior and consequent incarceration, the repeated infidelity, and the patterns of intimate violence that are the villains looming largest in poor mothers' accounts of relational failure." And, of course, the 90s was before the normalization of pornography. Today, we see the result of the massive depersonalization and normalization of porn in various but interconnected issues.
Strangulation is without a doubt an indicator that the perpetrator isn't against killing their partner. Did you know that there isn't a more deadly form of domestic violence? A victim can lose consciousness within seconds of strangulation. Death can happen within minutes. Batterers who strangle their victims are more likely to engage in other extreme acts of violence. Odds are, they're willing to kill. Here's an interesting but horrifying fact. Abusers who choke their partners have increased rates of mental illness. But mental illness does not cause abuse, no more than alcohol does. The psychological problems interact with the abusiveness, and it's a deadly combination. A mentally ill abuser has two separate but interrelated problems, neither of which are yours to solve. If you have ever been strangled by your partner, you are 10 times more likely to be murdered. Breaking your trauma bond can often be life or death. Create a safety plan in order to leave.
Although often portrayed and discussed as just another erotic trick for the bedroom, strangulation is associated with intimate partner murder and cannot be safely conducted. Those who experience multiple instances of sexual choking or strangulation face brain damage in regions related to motor control, consciousness, and emotion. This trend is increasingly prevalent among young adults, with 58% of women college students having ever been choked during sex. The role of pornography cannot be ignored, as most participants described first becoming aware of choking in high school or college, between 12 and 18 years of age, and cited friends, partners, pornography, media, including fan fiction and 17 magazine, and other internet content as sources. Despite many studies arguing for the benefits of dual-parent households and many asking for a return to traditional nuclear families, few men want to get married than ever before. This is linked to excessive porn use, which has been known to create a decreased value on the institution of marriage, the desire for children, and the need for faithfulness in a relationship, as well as beliefs that sexually deviant behavior is more common than it is. In turn, violence against women has increased, as between 2014, the lowest year on record, and 2020, the incidence of femicide in the United States has increased by 24%. In addition, intimate partner violence rose an estimated 8% during the coronavirus pandemic and does not appear to have subsided. A feeling of entitlement to women's bodies and sexual access, combined with the hatred of women, has also created a bustling online market for ill-gotten nudes. Although many states have laws that prohibit revenge porn, no federal law criminalizes the creation or sharing of fake pornographic images in the United States, which makes it difficult to prosecute or shut down. The rule of the internet, everything is permanent, remains true. Even after one site is shut down, another often pops up with the same images. Police are often slow to investigate and prosecute, which is what happened in Levittown, where one teen posted deepfakes, doxed his classmates and peers, and sexually harassed his peers to the point of dropping out of college. One woman affected describes her experience. She saw Anna, a classmate, in her cheerleading uniform, and Ruby, a friend who'd sat beside her in detention. Then she saw a photo she recognized. It was her, at 18, standing in a dressing room. But the swimsuit she'd been wearing in the original photo she'd uploaded to social media was gone. Someone had digitally altered the picture so it looked like she was posing completely naked. She knew the breasts weren't hers, but they looked real enough that other people might think they were. She was too stunned to speak. The next image made her gasp. It showed a printout of a photo taken when she was 5, with the chubby cheeks and ringlets she'd long since grown out of. An erect penis rested atop the photo, touching her face. The accompanying post encouraged men to ejaculate on it. Then she read, "Spit on the Spanish spick."
She just went off and pulled me down to the floor.
Heritage High School teacher Tawana Turner says in that moment, as the 15-year-old girl pounced, God spoke to her.
I heard the God say, "Don't hit her."
Other teachers had to jump in and pull the teen off of her. Turner would spend the next 6 days in the hospital.
When I got out of the hospital and came home, it hit me that I had been injured really bad and I can't go to work. I can't see my students. I can't do anything that I used to do. I can't drive.
The Rockdale County District Attorney's Office tells Fox 5 that the 15-year-old girl pleaded guilty to aggravated battery against a teacher, which is a felony. Last week, a judge sentenced her to a year in the youth detention center, followed by 5 years of supervised release. What allegedly caused the girl to go off when Turner tried to take her phone.
The young lady, hopefully she will grow from this.
Sexual and physical violence are becoming more common, not just amongst adults, but also amongst students. Any teacher can attest to the influence that figures like Andrew Tate's and porn use have in the classroom, where staff and female students are told that they are lesser, not worthy of respect, and have to listen to sexual harassment throughout the day. One Canadian study found that 77% of members have personally experienced or witnessed violence against staff members, and this doesn't account for the rise of violence between students. Amongst all of these problems, the economy and societal pushback to feminism is pushing women into the arms of violent misogynistic men and urging men to blame their ills on women in the women's rights movement. Idris Calhoun writes in What's the Matter of Women, "In academic performance, boys are well behind girls in elementary school, high school, and college, where the sex ratio is approaching 2 female undergraduates for every 1 male, when it was an even split at the start of the 1980s. Rage against self-designated incels and other elements of the online manosphere appears to be steering some impressionable teens towards misogyny. Men are increasingly dropping out of work during their prime working years, overdosing, drinking themselves to death, and generally dying earlier, including by suicide. And men are powering the new brand of a reactionary Republican politics, premised on a return to better times when America was great, and, unsteadily, when men could really be men. Of course, this quote doesn't exactly explain why. I'm not so cynical as to think that men want to fail or are incapable of keeping up with modern requirements for success. It's the circumstances of the world today that are turning young men towards misogyny, hate, and failure. A friend of mine captured this phenomenon well. American men inherited from their fathers and grandfathers a clear model of how a man is supposed to be, but that model requires an economic situation that doesn't exist anymore. Therefore, the American man is set up to fail, which makes him miserable. And we know what miserable people do. They make things miserable for those around them. From there, it's obvious what happens. Porn addictions, violence against women, toxic masculinity, Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson, all that. And of course, there is the ever-increasing problem of technology outpacing our ability to adjust, moderate, and legislate it.
What's the deal with those weird refrigerator screens? Why have they started showing up everywhere? Well, here's the real reason. So, I was recently at an absolutely terrible, incompetently run, dirty pharmacy that we'll call Walgreens for the sake of this video. Now, while I was there, I started to take a look at the weird screens they had in the refrigerator section. I noticed something interesting about them. Now, supposedly the purpose of these screens is to show you ads, right? That's what they're telling you. But you know what else can show you ads? Literally any other surface. It doesn't need to reduce the functionality of something in order to show you ads if you just put it on the walls. So then that's not it. Let's take a look at the patent. The real purpose of these screens is to use the little camera at the top right here to scan your face and use AI facial expression analysis to judge whether or not you like the packaging designs of the product you're looking for. So you're not the target of the ad, you're the data being sold. Now here's an unrelated cleaning tip. Nail polish is impossible to remove from polycarbonate without ruining the surface due to the solvent in nail polish remover. So make sure you keep it away from stuff like safety goggles, car headlights, webcam lenses, and compact discs unless you want to ruin them.
Children are going to kindergarten unable to hold a pencil because they don't have grip strength. Instead of playing with physical objects, they spend hours in front of a screen. The echo chamber effect and bombardment of information create passive nihilists out of internet users who become increasingly apathetic and uncaring of the world around them. We live under constant surveillance, not just from our phones, computers, the stores we shop at, the places we eat, but from each other via social media and filming in public spaces. The internet is ever changing and becoming increasingly hostile to users, yet we depend entirely upon it. So what happens when it collapses? Amidst the economy being dire, a lack of pathways to improve one's economic class, a decimation of the middle class, and increasing hostilities towards women, there are plenty of things wrong with the world today. But even with a host of evidence to back up these reasons, many will prefer to deny they exist, as they assume that the world works as it always has. It's one of the reasons why job advice from my parents doesn't often work, and why it can be challenging to explain why you can't afford an apartment to a middle-class retiree. The metrics of success we used to have stayed the same instead of changing with the times. Or rather, the tools and realities of adult life have not adapted to maintain the same standard of living of the generations of those before us. While previous generations could have been better, they were at least moving forward steadily. Today seems worse in comparison because there's little to look towards, and each improvement comes with a host of detriments. In the past, the future was envisioned to be bright, to create more leisure time, to have less labor, and more everything. Suffering would decrease, and all the societal ills that plague society would be lessened, except that's not true. The world is just as broken as it ever was. This, dear viewers, is where we part. This topic is very broad, and therefore I've only dabbled on various items. I mean, we could go on for ages about how we've lost privacy over the past 50 years, and that could be a whole novel, to be honest. But what it comes down to is, I've lived abroad for at least, I believe it's about 10 months over the past 2 years. And yes, the United States is supposed to be this first world wonderful country, but I came back and I remember exactly why I left. It's so hopeless trying to get on my feet here. Any people my age, you can't find in a single studio or one-bedroom apartment for a reasonable price. You are seeing rooms for rent going for twice the cost of an apartment abroad. You find it impossible to get on your feet because everything costs so much more money than it used to, from health insurance to groceries to transportation. And then, of course, older people don't get it. the advice that they give is outdated because the world has changed so much. If you've been working in the same field for years, or you own your own business, then suggestions to, for example, just walk in and ask for an interview, they don't apply anymore. You can't just ask for a job. You can't just interview. You can't just expect to graduate college and to be able to find a place of employment. And what are you supposed to do with that? If you guys have any comments, questions, or concerns, leave them in the comment section down below, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.